which discourse reference are in play. We know what standards of precision are around, maybe. Another thing I think we know and track about each other in conversation is not a common thing, but rather an individually distributed thing. We keep track of each other's positions, by which I mean here, just the assertions and denials that we've actually made in the conversation. And not only do we keep track of this just as like a thing we happen to keep track of, but some of the conversational moves we make depend for their felicity on whether people in the conversation with us have or haven't adopted certain positions. So, for example, the conversational move, no, I didn't eat it, is only an appropriate response if someone asserted that you ate it. Right? I didn't eat it might be fine on its own, but no, I didn't eat it is flagging a disagreement with someone's position and someone's assertion that you ate it, typically. So I think there's reason to think that these positions are important to think about in terms of tracking our conversational dynamics and in terms of tracking ways that certain conversational moves depend on what's happened earlier in the conversation. So there's some reason to think that these are actually involved in our conversational practices and are not mere sort of imported theoretical abstraction. So positions are their notion I just take directly from Greg's work on this, and I've been thinking about positions for a long time. The thing I'm wheeling out today for the first time, the thing I'm very, very curious about, I'm curious for feedback on anything, but I'm really curious for feedback here, because this is the bit, one, that's new to me, and two, that almost everyone here knows about more than I do, is framing this in terms of disagreement. So the second core notion that I'm going to draw on is the notion of disagreement between positions, binary relation between positions of disagreement. Often when we think about disagreement, we think about people disagreeing. I'm not going to talk much about people disagreeing, but I think thinking about people disagreeing can give you a lens on what it is for positions to disagree. And the lens is something like this. We should think of positions disagreeing when one person's adopting the first position. I'll talk to someone adopting a position. By that I just mean asserting all the things asserted in the position and denying all the things denied in the position. Right? So adopting a position is this sort of complex of speech acts where you just do the things the position does. So I'll think of positions of disagreeing basically when if one person adopts one of the positions and someone else adopts another position, that adoption constitutes a disagreement between the people. Right? And I'll lean on this constitution once in what follows, but that once is going to ramify. So I should say what I mean by this constitute. I don't take it to just be, if you overheard them do this, you would reasonably conclude that they disagree. Right? So that might happen all over the place. There might be all kinds of things that you could overhear people do where you would reasonably conclude they disagree, right? So if one person says eating animals is wrong and another person says hunting is fun, right? If you overheard that, you might naturally conclude that they disagree. But those assertions do not themselves constitute a disagreement, right? They're best indicative of some underlying disagreement. So the notion I want is the notion of positions constituting a disagreement, right? We're asserting them, that is adopting one position and adopting the other, genuinely suffices for it to be the case that there's a disagreement, and not just serves as good evidence. And I'll just write the frown between some positions to mean disagreement between the positions. That's, I hope everyone can remember the hashtag. But I'm just going to, that means P disagrees with Q. I'll just keep a kind of running notation thing there so you can remember what we did. Okay, so here's some boring notation that turns out to be useful for various purposes. And right, positions are built out of sets. They're just pairs of sets. So you can consider subset lifted pointwise to this notion of a subposition. Right? One position is a subposition of another, just in case the assertions are a subset of the assertions and the denials are a subset of the denials. You can think here of a subposition as if you've adopted one position, a superposition of that is an option for you to go on, right? It's something that you could do without retracting anything you've already done. You could simply go on, make more assertions and denials, and arrive at having adopted that superposition. And the other useful notion is going to be the union between positions. Again, it's just pointwise. there's two interpretations that are worth keeping in mind, two different ways that you can think about this. One way to think about this is as taking two different speakers who have adopted their respective positions and are trying to combine them into a more total view of the situation. Right there, let's put our heads together kind of understanding of position union. Another interpretation that's going to be useful to come on them is again thinking about options for going on. Right? So thinking about a single person. And now they've adopted the first position, and they might want to consider, okay, what if I were now to go on and make these additional assertions and denials, right, without retracting anything? Well, what position would they arrive at doing so? Again, the union of the two positions. But I think it's fruitful to be able to think back and forth between the sort of dialogical and monological ways of thinking about this union. They come together. So, anyway, you see these square set theoretic looking things, they just mean the position ones. It's just boring notation, but it's handy. Here's the interesting notation. The interesting notation starts with this notion of self-disagreement. We'll see more about, I'll give you a very plausible, wink, assumption about disagreement in a moment, and that will suffice to make self-disagreement of some import. Right? So far we've just said disagreement's a binary relation on positions. That leaves open, of course, that some positions disagree with themselves. And in fact, that notion is going to be of sufficient importance that it's not a special notation. So, I'll use the turnstile here. And that just means that this position disagrees with itself. Sometimes I issue P's and Q's and stuff for positions, and so there's no place in the middle of it to stick the turnstile, so I just do the superscript turnstile for a position that disagrees with itself. Again, that just means the same thing. This will turn out to be handy. Little positions. It's useful to think about little positions. That is a position that consists just of a single assertion, a position that consists just of a single denial, and I'll use the plus and minus notation that's in relatively common use among bilateralists for at least similar ideas. In this case, those will pick up positions, right? So the plus and minus give you positions, and these are positions. Oh no, I used a lowercase Greek letter. I lied about my letters. Later on, I'll use Roman letters. Oh no. Oh, I'm very sorry. That's no good. Okay, anyway, little positions, right? So, I probably should have stuck with the lowercase Greeks because I'm using a capital Romans for positions. Yeah, and I should have stuck with lowercase Greeks throughout. Sorry. So anyway, the plus one is the one that just asserts that sentence, and the minus one that's the denial one, is the one that just denies it. And finally, and this is where the sort of semantic, the compositional semantics is going to operate, is on this notion of a disagreement range. So each position has a disagreement range, and the disagreement range of a position is just the set of positions that it disagrees with. And that's the notion that's going to turn out to be relatively central when we think about how to actually give semantics for particular pieces of vocabulary. And I'll also sometimes use this equivalence notation just to mean having identical disagreement ranges. So two positions are equivalent just means that for any other position you like, one of them disagrees with that position if and only if the other one does. As far as disagreement can tell, they're the same. Right? Their internal structure might be different. They might contain all kinds of different assertions and denials. But as far as what they disagree with, as far as that goes, the difference doesn't matter. Okay, enough notation out of the way. I'm going to make two structural assumptions about disagreement. And these are going to bear an absolute ton of weight. I really don't know what things look like when you start dropping these assumptions. I know a little bit about what things look like when you drop this one, and I know absolutely nothing about what things look like when you drop the next one. Part of why I'm interested in thinking about things this way, right, is having to make these assumptions explicit gives you options to think about, well, what happens when we throw them out? But I don't know what happens when we throw them out. So now I'll just tell you what happens when we don't talk about them. So here's the first assumption, which is that if two positions disagree, then superpositions of those positions also disagree. This is the part where it's crucial that I made the notion of disagreement about. Adopting these positions itself constitutes a disagreement, not is good evidence of a disagreement. Because if it were just good evidence of, this would definitely fail. Right? You can easily imagine if one person says eating animals is wrong and another person says hunting animals is fun, and that they could go on to a certain denial of kinds of things, such that you would discover that they never disagreed at all. Maybe it was the same person all along and they were perfectly coherent. It's had an all-out view. But if adopting a position B and adopting a position Q constitutes a disagreement, the disagreement is already present just in P and Q, then that disagreement remains present when people go on and experiment this out, or at least I'll assume that as we go forward. It follows from this assumption, though, that if we have two positions that disagree with each other, then the combination of them self-disagrees. Because I can just plug the combination in for the primes and they happen. So this is one reason that self-disagreement is going to turn out to be a relatively important notion. This monotonicity assumption means essentially whenever you have a disagreement, you have some other self-disagreement. Right? Wherever there's a disagreement, you combine those and you get a self-disagreement. The other assumption I'm going to make is the converse of this corollary. Which is that if two positions, when put together, result in a position that disagrees with itself, then those two positions disagree with each other. Right? So I think the easiest way to think about this is think about union on the dialogical conception here, right? Think about two people who are having a conversation with each other. One of them's adopted P, the other's adopted Q. Now I tell you about them just this. If you put what they've said together, you reach a position that disagrees with itself. I think it's reasonably plausible anyway to think that, well, that's enough for you to conclude that those two people do disagree with each other in virtue of having taken up the thing. Right? There's a sense in which what they've said cannot be combined without ending up disagreeing with itself. So I reckon they disagree with each other. Again, I think part of the interest of articulating this is seeing what happens when we drop it. I think there could be interesting reasons to drop particularly this one. But this is the one where I have no idea what happens when we drop it. Yeah, okay.
What if P already self-disagreeing?
No, there are no exceptions to this principle. And so, if P is already self-disagreeing, that does not make it an exception to this principle. Right? So if P is self-disagreeing, then it follows from monotonicity that P disagrees with P union Q, whatever Q is, and then it follows from disaggregation that P disagrees with Q. So it follows from these assumptions that a position that is self-disagreeing disagrees with everything. It also follows from this assumption that a position that self-disagrees, this is weaker but it's important to note, disagrees with the empty position. Right? So you might have thought at the outset that the empty position, making no assertions and no denials, could not possibly disagree with anything because after all it hasn't said it. I think that's a reasonable thing to think. It's incompatible with these assumptions to think that. What we have instead from these assumptions is that disagreement, the binary relation, can just simply be reduced to self-disagreement, the unitary relation. And I'm going to use that a ton in terms of looking at how this pans out. But I think that I'm going to use it because it's really handy. It's nice and convenient to be able to think of things this way. But we shouldn't overstate it. We shouldn't overstate it for two reasons. One is the one I've been emphasizing as we go. These assumptions are questionable, and it's worth questioning them. And I think the broad framework of a position-theoretic approach can survive questioning these assumptions, right? Whether we have or don't have these assumptions is a question within a position-theoretic approach. It's not a question about whether we should be adopting a position-theoretic approach in the first place. The second reason, though, is that even if we hold these assumptions in place, even if it turns out that these assumptions are great and right and exactly what we want, it's disagreement that's directly tied to our conversational practices. The notion of self-disagreement is not something that I think comes in a great deal for a great deal of play in our kind of day-to-day conversational practice. So if we want to look at where a position-theoretic approach to meaning is going to ground out in our conversation, right, what are we actually doing that makes this a good way of understanding our words? I think binary disagreement is a better answer to that than this unary notion of self-disagreement, even if it turns out that extensionally you can make them line up. So, like I said, I'm just going to run wildly back and forth between them. I'll put those assumptions in force, but I do think it's worth starting and thinking in terms of binaries. So that's the basic kind of toolkit that I want to pick up. That's the toolkit that's going to play the role that models would play for a model-theoretic semanticist. That's the toolkit that's going to play the role that proofs would play for a proof-theoretic semanticist. Right? I want to use this kind of broad way of thinking about things. Thinking about positions, that is collections of assertions and denials, and this relation of disagreement among positions to do this kind of work. And I think it's worth noting that we can build a compositional semantics directly in these terms, that is, in terms that don't invoke truth, falsity, warrant, inference, any of those sorts of things. And that's one reason I think this is an importantly distinct approach from the kind of model-theoretic approaches or proof-theoretic approaches. Or to use a different vocabulary for a similar contrast, is neither a referentialist approach nor an inferentialist approach. I haven't said anything at all about reference yet, nor have I said anything about inference. Right? This is just about assertions and denials and conditions under which they come into conflict with each other. So, of course, the compositional semantics is going to work in terms of assertions and denials and the conditions under which they come into conflict with each other. Right? So it will be about assertion conditions and denial conditions. But not in the sort of warrant-theoretic sense that you sometimes see people talk about assertion and denial conditions. Right? Sometimes when people talk about assertion conditions, they mean conditions under which an assertion would be warranted. Or sometimes when they talk about denial conditions, they mean the conditions under which you have sufficient evidence to deny or conclusive evidence to deny or something like that. That's not at all. I'm going to think about assertion and denial conditions, but I'm talking about conditions under which those assertions and denials constitute disagreements with other positions. So here's an example. Yeah, right, all your favorite, well, I don't know, all your favorite. Many of what should be your favorite semantics textbooks start with examples that look a lot like, wait a minute, that's not a real word, that's a logic symbol. Why? Well, because it's just easier to see how things work if you start with things like negation and conjunction and so on. So, same strategy here. Let's start with negation and conjunction and so on. Again, I'm not putting this forward as a theory of logic, capital L or small l. I don't know anything about logic, capital L or small l. I find it very confusing to theorize about logic, capital L or small l. I'm trying to talk about language, real language, natural language, the kinds of languages we speak, and getting a semantic framework in place that can work with those. But I think there's a long-standing tradition, and a good one, of using these sorts of languages that logicians have come up with as nice little toys to try out various semantic theories, and so I'm going to follow through and do that here as well. So, here's a compositional semantics for negation. Let's digest this, break it down. What does it say? By the double line, I just mean if and only if. So, the left one of these says that a position that includes a denial of A self-disagrees if and only if the corresponding position that includes an assertion of the negation of A instead also self-disagrees. And similarly, the one on the right, the position that includes an assertion of A self-disagrees if and only if the corresponding position that includes a denial of the negation of A self-disagrees. So yeah, you've got the assertion and denial conditions for the negation of A in terms of the assertion and denial conditions for A. It's a compositional semantics in a very, very straightforward sense. And this is the kind of compositional semantics for negation that I've been running around using as an example for a while. But the disagreement way of approaching, I think, gives us, you'll note it's just kind of cognitively complex to understand what I just said, right? Reading those sorts of things. You look at it and you go like, okay. And then if you do like I do and you just like sit in a room for a long time, you bang your head off and at some point you think, oh yeah, that makes sense. But like when you first encounter it, I've seen many audiences glaze over seeing this, and very, very reasonably. I think the disagreement approach gives us a way of simplifying it. So all I'm going to do now is say things that are perfectly equivalent, given everything I've already told you to this. So here's the thing that's perfectly equivalent to this. This is just steps of disaggregation and monotonicity to get the equivalence in between. This is why I'm saying those assumptions really bear a lot of weight. Okay, well, one thing we can do top of positions that disagree with each other. So looking at the left one, what we can say is, look, the little position that just denies A and does nothing else disagrees with an arbitrary position, if and only if the little position that asserts not A and does nothing else disagrees with that same arbitrary position. I find that more understandable, right? It's exactly the same thing given the assumptions implied. And same on the right, right? Asserting A disagrees with something if and only if denying not A disagrees with that. But since those positions are arbitrary, here's the real, I think, nice, convenient, clean compositional semantics story. The compositional semantics operates on disagreement ranges. And so what's the disagreement range for an assertion of a negation? It's exactly the disagreement range of the denial of the negation. What's the disagreement range for a denial of a negation? It's exactly the disagreement range for the assertion of the negation. So in some sense, there's no difference in cognitive complexity here, right? But it's just that all the cognitive complexity in the rules, it's always this very same pattern. And this just buried that pattern in the notion of a disagreement range so that we can look directly at what's really happening here, right? Which is that we're getting disagreement conditions for a negation out of the disagreement conditions of the negation. There's no difference in the theory from any kind of standard bilateralist theory. Right? This is just a different way of expressing it, but I'm finding these days more useful. As it happens in these cases, you could also do it in terms of equivalence, right? Because we just have identities between disagreement ranges. So you say, okay, the position that just denies A is equivalent to the position that asserts the negation A. But it's the disagreement range line that I think is where the action ought to be seen as located. Second example, conjunction. Again, you can understand these if and only if sort of claims. Take, for this if and only if, where it's got two things above it, take those things as conjoined within the scope of the if and only if. So, an assertion of a conjunction in the context of a broader position, that broader position self-disagrees if and only if the corresponding position but that asserts both conjuncts rather than the conjunction also self-disagrees. Denial of a conjunction in the context of a broader position self-disagrees if and only if each of the positions reached by removing that conjunction and replacing it with a denial of the respective conjuncts self-disagrees. Yet here. Simplify it. Asserting a conjunction disagrees with a position if and only if asserting both conjuncts does. Denying a conjunction disagrees with a position if and only if denying the first conjunct disagrees with that position and denying the second conjunct disagrees with that position. Okay, but those positions were arbitrary, so here's the real compositional story in terms of disagreement ranges. Right? Disagreement range of the assertion of a conjunction is the disagreement range of the position that asserts both conjuncts. On the other hand, the disagreement range of the denial of a conjunction is an intersection of disagreement ranges. The disagreement range of the denial of the first conjunct and the disagreement range of the denial of the second conjunct. Again, these all just say the same thing, given what's gone on so far, but I think the notion in terms of disagreement ranges gives you focuses on what matters here, focuses on what's distinctive to conjunction, rather than the general kind of pattern of quantifying over side premises and so on. That's common to all of these. Now, in this case, the left one of these results in an equivalence between positions, but the right one, that can't be stated in terms of an equivalence. That's fine, right? The equivalence is sometimes useful, handy to have around, but it's the disagreement ranges is really where the action is. Worth noting, you cannot always get equivalence. Even though we start with these double line if and only if rules, right, it's not always the case that an equivalence between positions falls out. Okay, so you may have noticed that the first line on those slides looked awfully proofy. Right? Those things that I was saying were disagreement conditions for negation and disagreements for conjunction were, and the notation is not a coincidence, right? They're very much inspired by standard sequence calculus rules for things like negation and conjunction. But note that as rules, they played absolutely no role here. That this is a rule and that is a rule was no part of what I just said. What constitutes a proof? Absolutely no part of what I just said. Not even implicitly. Right? That was just not about proofs. It included some structures that are a lot like proofy structures. It also included some structures that are a lot like bodily structures. But I just wasn't using those similarities. Right? It's not about proofs, it's not about models. All that matters is which positions that sort of makes true everyone's assertions and false everyone's denials, that's, you know, if you built your model theory in the right kind of way, you can take that as evidence of non-disagreement, sort of certificate of non-disagreement. Right? Here's the way things could be where agreements aren't. That could give you a certificate of non-disagreement. But the certificate as a certificate doesn't matter. All I care about is the non-disagreement. Similarly, you can see a proof as a way of showing disagreement. Right? And, you know, maybe you suppose, particularly a sequent calculus proof, maybe you suppose primitive disagreements and then build up those disagreements to disagreements among complex sentences. And again, a prima proof might give you a certificate of disagreement. Right? So look, here's a thing that rules out you both being right. You disagree. Well, fair enough, certificates of disagreement are handy, but I don't care about the certificate. All I care about is the disagreement. Right? So this is genuinely neither monotheoretic nor proof theoretic. The only question is which positions disagree. And if disagreement reduces to self-disagreement, as I've shown, then everything entirely is settled just by which positions self-disagree. And so the formal tools of most direct use are consequence-theoretic formal tools. And I have here, things out of the sort of Polish tradition of thinking of consequence operations. They need to be liberalized to deal with multiple right-hand sides, but ways of thinking directly about consequence relations, rather than thinking about proofs that determine and the models that determine them. Proofs and models are lovely indirect ways of getting at this stuff. I have no complaints about proofs and models. Some of my best friends are proofs and models. But the tools of most direct relevance simply operate directly on the extension of the consequence relation. Those are the formal tools that are going to matter. Okay. How are we going time-wise? Yeah. So that's the broad framework that I'm thinking in terms of. I said at the outset I wanted to both put it on the table, but also address a potential objection to it. So I'll now turn to that objection and try to respond to it. So what do we want semantics to do? Here's Daddy-Wall and Peters, right? It's a handy sentence. Usually people don't tell you what they're up to, but they give us a sentence where they said what they were up to. It's nice. In constructing the semantic component of a grammar, we are attempting to account for speakers' judgments of synonymy, entailment, contradiction, and so on. And I want to focus on entailment here. Because I think there's some reason to think that theories in this broad area cannot give us a reasonable understanding of entailment. Indeed, people have argued theories in this broad area cannot give us a reasonable understanding of entailment. And so I want to show you that they can. So, in some sense, there might seem to be an easy path to entailment here. The turnstile is at least reminiscent of entailment-like things, right? I mean, it's not a coincidence that I use the sort of consequency notation there. Using a consequency notation for a notion like that is exactly the inspiration that I'm taking from multiple conclusions in the first place. Like, that's the key idea, is you write that with a turnstile, and then you say, oh, it's enlightening. So it might seem like, well, let's use that turnstile to give our theory of entailment. And I think there are things that can be said about that defend it. So I'll show you a way of you can add some more controversial assumptions as though there weren't already enough. And you can come to reach the conclusion that at least gets the extension. But I think it's not a good way of understanding what entailment is, even if it happens to be extensional. So here's the problem, and this is the problem. I'll take Steinberger's way of pressing it. This is Steinberger objecting to Greg's account in the multiple conclusions-y kind of way, but it adapts, I think, very straightforwardly to be a problem. If it works at all, it's a problem for what I'm doing too. And here's his objection to that kind of approach. Let's take the example of the classical theorem of the excluded middle. This would have to be rendered as, it is incoherent to deny A or not A. Or in the current setting I'm working with, right, the position that simply denies A or not A self-disagrees. That's what you get if you do it in terms of the turnstile. But surely this is not what is intended. Even the intuitionist can agree that it is incoherent to deny every instance of A or not A. We need a way of expressing that A or not A can always be correctly asserted. Right? That you can't deny something is a prohibition. But it looks like there's an important entailment-like notion that's not a prohibition, that's permissive. It gives you a way of going on. So this turnstile, this self-disagreement notion, right, it just says this position disagrees with itself. That doesn't tell us that we can go on. But entailment, at least as we often think about it, us to go on. It gives us this sort of permissive status. In the limiting case, right, which is what Steinberger's talking about, right, we don't have any premises, but we just talk about something being a theorem or being entailed by nothing. Well, that should ensure that that thing is assertable. But of course, self-disagreement doesn't say anything about that. All it says is that you would disagree with yourself if you denied it. Does that give you permission to assert it? Not according to anything I've said so far. So this, I take it, is the problem with just picking up the turnstile, just picking up the notion of self-disagreement and saying that already gives you an answer for entailment. I don't think it does. Right? Self-disagreement is a prohibited status, and we want a permissive status out of entailment. And so in some sense, I buy Steinberger's argument. I just think it was an option to use the turnstile. And if you see, I felt like I should say something about truth and falsity at some point. So if you thought that truth and falsity were just projections from assertion and denial, then you could frame the same point in terms of truth and falsity, right? This turnstile status just says you can't have the left things be true while the right things are false. But entailment is supposed to help us move from truth to truth, not from truth to lack of falsity. And so, similarly in the limiting case, right, the sort of theorem, you got to have a guarantee of its truth, not a guarantee of its non-falsity. But we just don't have things in place to do that. However, I think we can build the sorts of things that let us do that actually pretty straightforwardly. So Steinberger's objection hits one relatively obvious way of trying to do it, but it doesn't touch what I think is a much better way of building theory of entailment out of these kinds of materials. So, just a reminder about equivalence, right? Positions are equivalent when they leave all the same options open for going on. So here's the notion of implicit assertion that I want to bring in view. A position implicitly asserts A if it's equivalent to the position you would arrive at starting from it and then actually asserting A. Right? So a position implicitly asserts A if going on to assert A would make no difference at all to what you disagree with. Right? And adding an assertion of A to a position that implicitly asserts A doesn't matter. And of course you can do the same thing for implicit denial, but I'm going to focus on implicit assertion. But all of this has a mirror image in terms of thinking about denial. So I'll focus on assertion. It does, implicit assertion is, if I had a better name I'd use it, but it has at least the following misleading feature. Explicit assertion turns out to be a kind of implicit assertion. Right? If you've asserted something, and then you go on to assert it, yeah, that going on to assert, you already asserted it, right? So it's not going to change anything in terms of what you do or don't disagree with. So that is taking a position that asserts A and adding to it an assertion of A, you just reach the same position you started from. So if you've asserted something, you've implicitly asserted it. But not vice versa. There are positions, and we'll see some later, that implicitly assert things without having explicitly asserted them, without having asserted them. I'll stop saying explicit. When I say assert and deny, I mean explicitly assert and deny. Right, so implicit assertion is a broader notion than assertion. And it's this extra broadness that enables it to do the kind of work that we want from a theory of entailment. So here's the last bit of notation to bring on board. This double turnstile plus thing, implicit assertion, and that just means implicit assertion, which is to say P is equivalent to P together with the assertion of A. And this is, I think, the notion that's suited to fill the role of entailment. So part of why it's important to think about things in this way is because this is conditionally permissive. Right? If you've already adopted P, maybe you've already taken up disagreements with someone. Right? I'm not here to tell you not to do that. But if you were willing to do that already, you may as well go on and actually assert whatever you've implicitly asserted. You won't incur any further disagreement by doing so. That's the sense of permissiveness that we get out of it. Right? It's not this absolute, yes, you may assert A. It's, given that you've already taken on some range of commitments by making some assertions and denials. You were clearly willing to do that. That's your problem. But having done it, you won't get yourself in any more trouble if you actually go on to make the assertions of things that you've implicitly asserted, or similarly denials of things that you've implicitly denied. And that, I think, gives us the right kind of permissive approach to thinking about entailment. It acts a lot like an entailment relation. It's got some structural properties that people who have views about what structural properties entailment ought to have might like. It doesn't have exactly the usual structural properties because we've got to the left of the turnstile as parasets and not an individual set. Right? It's a position on the left of the turnstile. So the usual structural properties don't perfectly match onto this, but monotonicity is relatively straightforward. That's monotonicity in the normal sense. It just uses subposition instead of subset. Right? If a position implicitly asserts something, and if you go on and add more to it, you continue to implicitly assert the same thing. Getting this through, I don't want to walk through the details of why it works, except to flag a kind of reasoning that's very useful in terms of actually getting any results out for this kind of thing. Which is to note at some point you get to this big union of things disagrees with something, and now you can just pull things out of that union and union them up on the other side. And then do your manipulations, and now you get there, and now you just pull things out of the union and back over there. What's supporting that, again, are monotonicity and disaggregation. Right? This idea that for two positions to disagree with each other just is for their combined thing to self-disagree. Right, so being able, as long as you've got a chain of unions disagrees with a chain of unions, you can rearrange them absolutely freely in this kind of reasoning. Which feels shady. Right? Like, it's handy, it's useful to be able to prove these sorts of things, but I think it's worth, again, revisiting those initial assumptions and saying, wait a minute, what do things look like when we start digging under there? But anyway, as long as we can get away with it, I'm going to get away with it. So the assumptions are in place, so let's rearrange wildly. And you can get from that kind of rearrangement that implicit assertion is monotonic, right? Having implicitly asserted something is a status that's preserved by adding more assertions and denials to a position. It also has other structural properties that you might expect that an entailment might be. It has this approximation of reflexivity. The little position that asserts A implicitly asserts it. Already flagged that one. It has this approximation of something like transitivity. I mean, if a position asserts A, and adding an actual assertion of A to that position would implicitly assert B, then the position already implicitly asserts B. Because the whole point of implicit assertion is that adding an actual assertion doesn't affect anything disagreement theoretic. Yeah. So if you like to think about and you might be concerned about other forms of transitivity, position combining sorts of things and so on, but we've already got the analogs of contraction and monotonicity in place, so they're all equivalent. So this is transitive in all the ways you would think about things being transitive. So if you're one of these people who thinks that not only is it important that entailment be permissive, it's important that it act like an entailment relation, by which we mean sort of these structural sorts of things. Implicit assertion has all those structural sorts of things. It gives you that familiar entailment-y kind of feeling. Here's an example, given the story about conjunction assertion conditions I've already told you, of an actual implicit assertion that isn't an explicit assertion. Again, if you're interested in the reasoning, there's a reasoning, but you can mostly just ignore the gray stuff. Given the story about disagreement range of conjunction that's gone by, in particular, all we need is the disagreement range of assertion and conjunction. Conjunction's denial, conditions don't figure in here. Then it follows that the position that asserts two conjuncts has implicitly asserted the conjunction. Right? If asserting the conjunction would lead you to disagree with someone, you've already disagreed with them by asserting your conjuncts. That just falls out of the sort of picture we've got so far. And now back to the Steinberger style example. Suppose the empty position implicitly asserts something. Right? This would be the relevant analog of theorem for this kind of entailment notion. Well, since implicit assertion is monotonic, if the empty position implicitly asserts that, then everything implicitly asserts that. That is, no matter what you've already said or done, you may as well say A. Right? You will incur no new disagreements by by saying A, no matter what you've done. And this is, I think, the exact kind of permissive notion we should have been looking for. So implicit assertion, I think, is the right way for a position-theoretic approach to answer the Steinberger claim. In some sense, Steinberger is right. Just using the turnstile is not a good theory. But he's wrong to think that that's forced on a position-theoretic approach. There are other ways to do it, and here's one. Just want to finish up by thinking a little bit about the relationship between entailment, understood in this implicit assertion way, and what I call consequence, that is the turnstile, self-disagreement. Right? So we've got two different turnstiles floating around here. And it's worth asking about the relationship between them. So, first thing to note, getting to the implicit assertion claim that I showed you about conjunction, we assumed our structural stuff on disagreement, monotonicity, and disaggregation. And we assumed the assertion conditions I gave for conjunction. Worth flagging, that is not enough to show that you self-disagree by asserting the conjuncts and denying the conjunction. The claim that you self-disagree by asserting the conjuncts and denying the conjunction follows from absolutely nothing I've said. I've made a bunch of really strong assumptions, but not strong enough to give you that very basic thing. What you would need in addition is that you self-disagree by asserting and denying the conjunction. And you might think that's plausible, but I haven't assumed it. That is, on this sort of approach, entailment, the way I told you about it, is definitely reflexive, even if consequence isn't. Right? Consequence's reflexivity played no role in getting to the reflexivity of entailment. And indeed, it's not hard to make counterexamples. And this means, in general, we do not have an implication from a position's implicitly asserting something to it being the case that adding a denial would result in a self-disagreement. Right? Entailment does not imply consequence, given the assumptions on the table. Nor does consequence imply entailment, given the assumptions on the table. So take some sentence and some position, such that asserting the sentence disagrees with the position and denying the sentence disagrees with the position. If you want an example of what such a thing might be, right? Maybe the position has it that A is attributing a vague predicate to some borderline case, and maybe the way you understand vagueness, you shouldn't go around asserting that vague predicates apply to their borderline cases, and you shouldn't go around denying it. Well, if that were so, then it would be plausible enough that you'd have a position that says this is a borderline case, but asserting that it is, this is a borderline case of red, asserting that it is red disagrees with that position, denying that it is red disagrees with that position. Nothing we've said so far rules that out. Or for another kind of case you might think about like that, you might think about a liar sentence, right? Maybe the position says that A is a liar sentence. The position says A attributes falsity to itself, or A attributes untruth to itself. And you might think, well look, you better not assert such a thing. Right? That is, you disagree with the position that says it's a liar sentence if you assert it, because you shouldn't assert liar sentences. And similarly, you better not deny such a thing. You would disagree with the position that says it's a liar sentence if you deny it. You better not deny the liar sentence. Or you can think of other potential examples of this sort of thing, right? But essentially what I'm supposing is that a double bind has arisen. There's a position that both rules out asserting A and rules out denying it. If you can have anything like that happen, and in particular, if you can have anything like that happen such that that position somehow doesn't disagree with something, equivalently that it's not self-disagreeing. That is, if you can say, this is a borderline case of red without disagreeing with yourself, or if you can say, that's a liar sentence without disagreeing with yourself, I don't think it's completely plausible. You can't, after all, there are borderline cases of red. We see them all the time, right? There's no reason to think you disagree with yourself by pointing one out. There are liar sentences all over the place. Not as many as there are borderline cases of red, but there's rooms I tend to move through, there are liar sentences all over the place. And just pointing one out and saying that's a liar sentence, that doesn't involve you disagreeing with yourself. So as long as you think those sorts of things can happen, then what you have is a case where you cannot deny it without self-disagreement. That is, you couldn't add a denial of the sentence to the position gamma delta without self-disagreement. But nor has that position gamma delta implicitly asserted it. Right? You can't deny it. That was part of that assumption without self-disagreement. But if you had implicitly asserted it, you would already self-disagree, because adding an assertion would result in a self-disagreement. But you don't self-disagree. You just said a reasonable thing, like, that's a borderline case. So, in these sorts of cases, you get exceptions to the reverse. So entailment and consequence, neither of them implies the other in this sort of setup. In general, they're independent claims. But if you really are not satisfied, if you think, you know, Dave, the real problem with this talk is you don't make enough contentious assumptions from out of nowhere, then hopefully these last few will satisfy you. So here are contentious assumptions from out of nowhere. One of them is just that asserting something and denying the very same thing amounts to a self-disagreement. Or equivalently, that when one person asserts something and someone else denies that thing, they disagree with each other. Okay, that's not very contentious. And if you have that, you get a one-way implication. If you have that, entailment implies consequence. Right? If you implicitly asserted something, then denying it would lead you into a self-disagreement. As long as assertion and denial disagree with each other. I'm thinking that assertion and denial disagree with each other. Yeah, fair enough. And the other way, getting the other direction in place, requires the assumption that I sort of flagged and moved through before. If you think that double binds can't arise, right? If you think that any time you've adopted a position that disagrees with an assertion of A and disagrees with the denial of A, for any A, no matter what, you've always already disagreed with yourself. That is, if you think both that the sort of disagreement story I gave about borderline cases are right, and you think that there are borderline cases, or if you think that the sort of disagreement story I've given you about the liar sentence is right, and you think that there are liar sentences, then you will reject this. But if you were to accept this principle, right, if you were to say, whenever you've ruled out asserting A and denying A, you've already self-disagreed, then you get the implication in the other direction. Right? In that case, then consequence would imply implicit assertion. That is, if you've ruled out denying it, and there are no double binds, well, then you may as well assert it. Right? The assertion can't cause any problems, because if assertion caused a problem, denial caused a problem. Oh no, you're in a double bind, but we assume the double binds couldn't arise. Yeah. So you can get entailment and consequence to collapse by making these assumptions about, and you know, worth noting, right, that assertion and denial disagree with each other is at the very least considerably more obvious than the no double binds condition. Right? This one I think is contentious for good reason. But if you impose it, you can get an entailment and consequence to collapse. But even still, this is just an extensional match. Using the single turn style, using self-disagreement to give a theory of what entailment is not a good theory of what entailment is, even if it happens that it holds in all the cases where entailment in fact holds. Right? It's not a good theory because it's prohibited, but entailment should be permissive. So implicit assertion gives us, I think, the plausible kind of way, anyway, a much more plausible way than consequence does to answer the Steinberger objection. In some sense, then, Steinberger's point stands. We want some permissive, positive status, some status that gives us something like a guarantee of a thumbs up to the conclusion, rather than something that prohibits saying bad things. Consequence doesn't do that, but implicit assertion does. And implicit assertion here has been built not out of notions of truth, not out of notions of inference, not out of notions of warrant, not out of notions of reference. Right? The raw materials here remain simply positions and disagreement. Whether and how implicit assertion is connected to consequence itself is a matter for these contentious, it's a matter for these assumptions. I suppose it's probably contentious whether they're contentious. But I contend that they're contentious. And so it's a matter for them. So that's the picture. Thanks very much.